Hello and welcome to this video in which we will talk about the American strategy in the Pacific. We are fortunate to have Benjamin Blandin for this video. Hello, thank you to you. You are based in the area?
Absolutely, in Malaysia. A specialized PhD on the subject, that's right, a PhD in geopolitics with a thesis on asymmetric warfare in the South China Sea.
Let's watch our first video on this topic, the fourth one we've collaborated on with a true expert. So from my anti-imperialist point of view, the Americans are the dominant force in the Asia-Pacific. Is this an anti-imperialist vision, or is this really how it happens on the ground then?
Imperialist power, yes, absolutely. The US has been a vital power since World War II and the Vietnam War, but China, Japan, and Korea have emerged as significant economic and strategic players in recent years, along with Australia, especially within the Australia, United Kingdom, United States framework. However, the US is no longer the sole hegemonic power.
But does that nevertheless mean that they have total freedom of action in the area? Do they dominate any of the other players? We're not talking about China or really today. Are they hindered in their ability to project military means?
So if we're talking about everything that's east of the famous First Island chain, yes, in that space, without being omnipresent or omnipotent, they can do a lot of things and they are clearly dominant. Then, on everything that is to the west or north of this First Island chain, no, it's not at all the current situation. Is it a presence and a power? We're talking about the pivot recently with Obama, the pivot from Europe to Asia. Is it a gradual rise in power for the past 150 years, or is it a comeback from the United States? So today, we're no longer on a comeback. That is to say, in my research work, one have denoted three main phases.
In the late 19th century, the Pacific Squadron was involved in engagements in Korea and China during its exploratory phase.
Then the phase of omnipresence and omnipotence, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War. Then the third phase, which is the geographical disengagement, military commitments, and the return with the pivot. We're there without being on a return of troops. We are more on a presence by rotation, the development of infrastructures, so it's like a footprint that is much less than it has been in the past.
When you talk about disengagement, does it mean that physically they had less power on the ground, on the field? Or simply that they no longer had the same will to impose friendly governments to the right, to the left? Then both. But I'm going to focus my answer first
more on the aspect of true presence. We go from 500,000 men in Vietnam, including the leave zones, Thailand, etc., around, plus the troops in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and even Taiwan until the 70s. We go from that, so really a very heavy military presence, to a complete disengagement of the 500,000 men in Vietnam. A disengagement in 1992 from the Philippines and a reduction of about a third or a little more in Korea and Japan. So they physically reduced, including in Korea and Japan. We're talking about almost 600,000 men in total who have left the theater.
But is it because we do better with fewer men thanks to higher capacity equipment, submarines, aircraft carriers, defense systems, nothing more effective? Or is it really their firepower on site has decreased?
First of all, as the Vietnam War ended, naturally, the troops that were there for Vietnam, the 500,000 GIs, went home. Then, Japan, Korea, over the years 84-90, the security aspect meant that there may have been, from the thinkers of the American strategies, the idea that we could do better with fewer men. Indeed, the capabilities of the materials have improved, so maybe we can see the future in it. It is a fact that there has been a 30% staff disengagement in Japan and Korea, a complete departure from Taiwan, and a departure from the Philippines at the authorities' request.
They had troops in Taiwan, yes. And they disengaged from Taiwan.
Of their own free will or at the request of the Taiwanese after the United States recognized Communist China as representing the one China principle, naturally American troops could not stay. So
we had a
troop disengagement, which the United States passed laws related to Taiwan, including the sale of weapon systems despite opposition.
Of course, and France also provided notably the Lafayette frigates, the Lafayettes. But then if we stay on the case of Taiwan, because it's still interesting to abandon Taiwan while we have men on the ground and we continue to militarily support the island, which is de facto independent today. There is an agreement, you said it, one don't remember what it's called, in the 70s, right? Exactly.
the Taiwan Relations Act.
Is the agreement still valid? Will they uphold it? Or will it be like the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons in exchange for border security guarantees, only to be ultimately abandoned by US?
Taiwan previously had a nuclear program. We don't talk about it much, but it's a reality. When one was talking about American presences, it wasn't necessarily massive. Abandoned, sorry. In any case, officially. I'm not an expert on nuclear weapons. In any case, what we know is that there wasn't necessarily a very strong military presence from the United States, but there were military advisors, a significant presence nonetheless. Then they left when the agreement with Communist China was passed. Then this did not prevent new laws from being passed to maintain and strengthen exchanges with Taiwan. The arms sales continued. Despite Taiwan's increasing arms orders, they feel there is a funnel effect limiting their acquisitions. And American deliveries are still quite slow and almost always late.
That's why they have their locally produced version of the F-16, etc. They are trying to be sovereign from the United States.
To have a minimum of sovereignty and technological and industrial independence.
But today they still respect the Americans, they still factually respect their commitments, or are they really backing down?
So, yeah, with the Philippines, I'm going to make a comparison. But with the Philippines, there is the Mutual Defense Treaty, which was signed in the 50s and sets a clear framework where the United States commits to defend the Philippines if they are attacked. Taiwan's situation differs. The United States maintains relations with Taiwan based on an agreement, but doesn't fully recognize it or commit to defending it unconditionally in case of aggression. Even so, it would be in their interest to do so. Nonetheless, officially, the framework is more flexible and less binding for Taiwan compared to the Philippines.
Okay.
And the Philippines, is there a particular reason why they have a proximity with this country, be it historical, or is it really to bother
the Chinese? Because
one, in the 19th century, as part of what one mentioned earlier, the Americans defeated the Spaniards and occupied the Philippines themselves.
They have them.
Occupied them until the early 40s. Finally, it was against the bets of the United States until the 40s, until after the Second World War. And then when the Philippines gained their independence, well, the American military presence was maintained until 92. And then there was this framework of 92 departures at that time as definitive and in fact return from the years 2010 within the framework of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement.
American initiative where the Philippines need the Americans to fight against the terrorists, etc.
What we observe, nevertheless, is that 92 departures of the Americans, 95 occupations of the Mischief Reef Atoll in the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines by China immediately after. And what we observe is also 2012, occupation of Scarborough Shoal, etc. So actually there is
really
a cause and effect link. Before the Americans left, none of this happened. After the Americans left, all this happened. The Philippines sees a cause and effect relationship.
The Philippines are asking the United States to return to prevent further losses to China. The Americans find their account in it, since they are in this kind of containment policy towards China. Do they practice in the same way, for example, with South Korea?
So not yet with Korea, but the United States has been, let's say, the first step on this staircase. But then agreements of what we call visiting force agreement or reciprocal access agreement. So agreements that allow either joint exercises or the presence of foreign troops on Philippine territory have been signed or are still being signed with Japan, with France, with Australia, and probably other countries in the future. And with the
France, it's cooperation in the development of military equipment, or we want to go a little further.
So development of military equipment, we're not there. Then what we're doing today, already we have a defense attaché. Recently, we have an armament attaché. We have done what we call innocent passage, so unarmed ship passages, port stops, port calls, and also naval exercises already. We just did one, there will be others. So there you have it, the French presence is strengthening. We also have Naval Group, which has a branch in Manila. They likely wish to keep selling ships and possibly submarines as well. France may also potentially sell Rafale jets to the Philippines. Okay.
Is it about the United States, the pivot? We're talking about this return to the Philippines, etc. But has this manifested itself in a resurgence, you say? But what is the goal? Again, is it just to stay on par with the Chinese, to curb the progress and aggression of the Chinese, or is there really a more distant strategic vision?
First, one thing it's important to say that the West in general, some say the collective West, that sort of thing, or the United States have no anti-China intentions. If China had not created tensions and maintained disputes in the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and East China Sea, the United States would likely have no basis for their current actions. There is indeed an American comeback, but it's quite different. We don't have a large military presence with tanks, planes, artillery, and troops there. We are discussing something far more nuanced. That it will be a capacity building, and a capacity building primarily for the benefit of the countries where these facilities are built. So on the EDCA sites, these are not American bases. These are Philippine bases open to the rotational presence of American troops. So for this, they need a network of airports or runways throughout the Asia Pacific in reality. However, these are not their bases, but facilities belonging to those countries. But they modernize them at their own expense so that in case of need, they can scatter their planes throughout the region to avoid their destruction.
And does this return of the American presence on the spot also come with pressure to purchase American armaments? I'm thinking of NATO. In NATO, the US succeeds in pushing the F-35 over other aircraft like the Rafale or Eurofighter. Does their presence on site impose on Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia to systematically buy American equipment? There is no doubt
Friendly pressures from the US. We must acknowledge this possibility. Then what is certain is that very few countries in reality in Southeast Asia have the means to acquire this type of material. Japan and Korea remain highly affluent and developed nations. Their economic development differs significantly from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And it's not an insult to those countries but it's factual. And then if we take Indonesia, Indonesia has Russian fighters, American fighters, just ordered French fighters, and in the program of the Korean stealth or semi-stealth fighter. For the United States, delivering F-35S to Indonesia might not make much sense. First, because Indonesia doesn't necessarily have the means to acquire it. Additionally, it could create risks of espionage, reverse engineering, or other disadvantages for the United States. Infrastructure and personnel are also required.
However, we do remember that the Rafale had won the competitions for fighter jets in South Korea and Singapore. In both cases, the Americans came to displace us and then sell their F-15 or F-35 fighter jets.
It's true, you are absolutely right. Then it can also be explained for historical reasons. These countries were allies of the United States long before they had privileged relations with France. So that surely played a role in the final decision.
So he was better, he still won the competitions.
We can regret it, but we can't be surprised by it.
How many GIs are based in South Korea?
From memory, around 30,000. That's still quite a lot, and 40,000 to 50,000. So one don't have the exact figure. That includes everything: aviation, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy. There is notably the large base of Yokosuka where American ships are stationed.
In Japan, American ships, particularly nuclear aircraft carriers, are still a significant presence. So we have the aircraft carriers.
Nuclear, we have the Arleigh frigates, we have the Zumwalt destroyers, and the Leader machines. Indeed, it is indeed a very notable presence. And then helicopter carriers or aircraft carriers as well. The United States has delivered about a dozen ships that are recycled from their own Coast Guard and are now serving in the Philippine Coast Guard Navy. So we're talking about ships that can be 35, 44, up to 97 meters long. So these are not just small ships either. 97 meters, that's starting to get a bit serious.
So what perspective do you see for the American presence in the Asia Pacific? And what evolution of their strategy can we imagine in the long term?
The ships one mentioned were logically delivered to the Philippines, as they were the American support point during World War I's Pacific War and the reconquest of the Philippines. So there are historical ties, military ties, strategic ties, intelligence ties. The Philippines is accustomed to managing American equipment. So there you have it. It was really done with the logic of ease. Then it doesn't stop there. That is to say, recently, the United States also delivered military equipment to Vietnam, to Malaysia, notably ships, but also drones, Scan Eagles, so that each of these countries can monitor its exclusive economic zone. There is intelligence sharing between these countries and the US in both directions.
Indeed.
The United States has funded the National Squad Center and the National Maritime Surveillance Center in Manila, Philippines.
Why don't they make an Asian NATO Asia Pacific? Why don't the United States try to impose an architecture that is quite profitable for them within the framework of NATO? Why don't they try to do the same thing there? So first of all, because
the level of fusion and analysis of information and intelligence is lower in the countries in question, because there is not a culture of cooperation between these countries. Working together would be complicated. And one thing, the United States does not want to expose itself to a criticism that would be very easy to say that the imperialists created NATO in Europe. Now it's going to be NATO in Asia. And one thing the United States has paid me for a long time, unfortunately, the image they generated with the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan, where they gave this image of imperialist intervention of a country that was voting at the UN. And then finally, whether it was yes or no, they went anyway.
It's more than an image they acquired at that time, it's a fact. Do you think the fact that they do not support Ukraine at the level that would be necessary to allow Ukraine to maintain its sovereignty gives the impression to these countries that are waiting for the American umbrella, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, etc.? Does seeing that they do not remember Ukraine enough scare them for their own sovereignty, their own American support in the future if it was necessary? One do not
think so. I'm convinced of it. The countries in the region closely monitor the events happening over there. Even Taiwan, of course, looks at what the United States is doing in Europe to know what the United States would be willing to do for them. One, and my interactions with officials from Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and even Thailand, one have been questioned about the conflict in Ukraine. One was asked for my analysis. The conflict is not distant or peripheral. It affects them, and there is genuine interest. Yes, it's far away, but they pay very close attention to it because it gives there potentially how the US positions itself. And we know very well that the Philippines in particular already in 1975, so more than 50 years ago, were already complaining about the vagueness of the United States, about their intentions on whether or not to respect or partially respect the defense framework that united them. So it's not entirely new, but indeed the conflict in Ukraine allows to reactivate these fears or this apprehension that some countries may have indeed.
The military support provided to Ukraine by countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Cambodia, which is providing demining equipment, raises the question of whether they are doing so under American pressure. In some cases, the support is technically and physically routed through the United States before being sent to Ukraine, possibly to avoid the perception of direct arming. One believes you're talking about the 155mm Korean shells, and the Japanese, it's the Patriot air defense system. Taiwan, they provided drones, they provided quite a lot of equipment. Do they do this because the Americans tell them, go ahead, help Ukraine? Or because they see that a Russian victory would tell China it's open bar, you can go ahead?
One, completely agree with this analysis. They clearly draw a parallel between them. If we allow Russia to get its way there, it will allow China to get its way here. It's really, and without consultation between these countries. Many indeed have this analysis. One, don't believe there was any American pressure. In other words, these countries don't necessarily have vast amounts of resources to relinquish. So if they do it, in quotes, it's wholeheartedly. One, is it enough? One, believe that Japan could do more. One, think Korea could do more. Southeast Asia would be very complex. But the important thing, one would say, is to help. If they do their best, that's great. But one, think it's really without any constraints.
Just a quick note, as we'll only discuss nuclear balance. You know that Russia, when it hesitated to use nuclear weapons at the end of 2022 in Ukraine, China came to see it saying, if you use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it allows Taiwan to arm itself with nuclear weapons, since there is a rule today of non-use of a nuclear weapon against a country that is not equipped. Is this rule, because you talked earlier about this Taiwanese nuclear program that was stopped, to your knowledge, are other countries on the verge of having it? South Korea, like Germany and Europe, could have had it a few months ago if they wanted to.
Historically, several nations have come close to possessing nuclear weapons. We know that Iraq tried it. We know that Taiwan also tried. Ukraine, it had it for real. One, and Southeast Asia, one thing today, only Korea and Japan or Taiwan would have the capacity in a reasonable time frame, that is to say a few years, to develop a nuclear weapon. But again, today we have ones that are equipped with sensors to detect this kind of things. So it would, one think, hardly go unnoticed. However, they can retaliate in other ways, such as with hypersonic missiles currently in development. We know that Taiwan has a missile force, hypersonic, to potentially strike the Three Gorges Dam or other targets in China. So they don't communicate about it naturally, but we know they exist.
We know that Japan is in
the process of extending some of its anti-ship missiles from 200 to 1,000 kilometers in range. Korea also has plans in this area.
And here we're talking about a 100% sovereign indigenous development without American support.
The sovereign in the sense that it's designed by engineers, technicians, and scientists from these countries. Scientists. In today's world, it's impossible to have products without components sourced from other places.
Last question, will the United States continue to rise in power as China becomes threatening, or will there be a point where they plateau simply because economically they can't
go any further? Today, very clearly, there is a plateau in terms of ship and submarine production and repair capacity in the United States. This is not a problem of yesterday. It has increased over the last 15 to 20 years, but today we are really in a crisis situation where the United States is making agreements with Japan and Korea because they do not have the capacity to ramp up. One don't know exactly what the bottlenecks are, but it has an impact.
Especially on Australia?
Today, nothing is less certain than that the famous 3 Virginia submarines will ever be delivered to Australia, if that is the case, and it will necessarily penalize the Australia, United Kingdom, United States class program itself. So we see there are cascading consequences for the United States, for the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia as well, naturally, because if we manufacture less and repair less and modernize less, it's a fleet that will simply be whittled down year after year.
You confirm that the Australian, American, English betrayal to trap the French on this Australia, United Kingdom, United States program, it is now established that Australia will no longer have submarines for a period.
That's absolutely certain.
That they have.
The Australian Admiralty itself said the Collins submarines were at the end of their life and operational potential 5 to 7 years ago. 5 to 7 years ago, it was already being said. So it will be necessary not to modernize, but to keep these submarines in a state of life, or rather survival, until either the Virginias or the Australia, United Kingdom, United States class arrive. That is until 2040 to 2045. So
we
are talking about 15 to 20 years with virtually no operational submarine force.
It will be an opportunity for the Chinese to attack. Listen, Benjamin, many thanks. Thanks, Xavier. We hope you enjoyed it. We will put all the links in the comments of this video, especially our interview about the HOCUS at the time we got fooled. The Australians are in a difficult situation because of the Americans. We hope you liked it. See you soon. Subtitling is key 501.